The smell of Cuban cigars and expensive cologne hung like a thick fog over the faulty air conditioning of Las Vegas's most exclusive restaurant in mid-1954. It was a stage of opulence and exhaustion, where the success of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis was ironically becoming the very prison that was separating them. The scene was a mosaic of dim light, immaculate tablecloths, and the nervous clinking of silverware, where America's elite gathered to worship or envy the Hollywood shine. But that night, the shine was about to go out, replaced by a heavy silence and the bitter taste of arrogance. At a secluded, circular corner table, Dean Martin's glass of whiskey reflected the room lights like a beacon of his lack of control, while his laugh, once jovial and charming, now had the sharp edge of sarcasm, transforming the trivial act of a clumsy waiter into a performance of public humiliation. The atmosphere was heavy with a silent tension, only broken by Martin's cruel jokes. The crooner's velvety voice, which enchanted millions, turned into a verbal whip that cracked against the dignity of the man in the white apron, whose hand trembled as he tried to clean up the mistake. Across the table, Jerry Lewis, America's most beloved clown, was uncharacteristically quiet, his expression reflecting the internal conflict of witnessing his partner's moral drift, and the weight of that observation was more suffocating than the ambient heat. The waiter, hunched in a posture of resignation, was only a peripheral figure, a mere object in the improvised spectacle of cruelty. But in a few seconds, he would become the catalyst that would force the loyal Lewis to confront his friend's shadow and the ethical fragility that fame had planted in Dean Martin's heart. Before we proceed, if you want more powerful stories like this, which reveal the morality behind the legends of Hollywood and delve into the depth of human relationships under pressure, comment your opinion on what is about to happen to the duo Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Leave your like to support the production of dense narratives and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement is what allows us to keep bringing intense, solemn, and cinematic accounts that transform backstage incidents into timeless lessons about character and difficult choices. This helps us maintain the authoritative and empathetic voice necessary to unravel these stories. The partnership between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, forged in the smoky, poorly lit clubs of New York in the 40s, had become, by the mid-50s, the most potent and profitable entertainment force on the planet, with astronomical fees and a schedule that demanded the sacrifice of their personal lives. They were the perfect contrast. Martin, the symbol of quiet charm and smooth singing, represented the adult ideal of cool, while Lewis was controlled chaos, the hyperactive kid who brought the energy and physical humor, a mirror to a society seeking lightness after the war. But the dizzying success in Las Vegas, with its blinding lights and constant flattery, began to corrode the foundation that supported this fragile and legendary chemistry. The incessant pace of shows, movies, and public appearances exhausted the duo, and this exhaustion served as a subtle fuel for the darker side of Martin's personality. That period was the peak and, silently, the beginning of the fissure. The pressure to maintain the standard of excellence under the critical gaze of an audience who paid fortunes for a perfect spectacle demanded an emotional price, and Dean Martin, who always sought detachment and indifference as shields, began to manifest his insecurity disguised as arrogance, especially when he felt exposed or contradicted. His whiskey glass was not just a stage prop, but an increasingly frequent refuge from the reality of fame, and the cynicism he cultivated as part of his stage charm spilled over into his life outside the spotlight, slowly transforming him from a laid-back, charismatic man into someone impatient, who saw others only as extensions of his own stage or trivial obstacles to be removed. Lewis's loyalty, once unwavering, began to be tested by these public displays of disrespect. For Jerry Lewis, the ascent of fame never diminished his deep connection with humility and the memory of where they came from. The small performances, the fight for recognition, the hunger for success before it materialized. Lewis carried an internal moral compass, calibrated by his profound empathy, which made him see the waiter in the restaurant, the driver on the way, and the stage cleaner as people, not as insignificant parts of his stardom scenery. And that is exactly why Martin's escalating behavior caused him such acute pain. He was not just observing a stage partner acting badly, but watching a friend drift away from his own essence, corrupted by the toxicity of adulation and the unrestrained power that money and visibility provided, a silent conflict that gnawed at him and that he tried to ignore, focused on maintaining the magic of the partnership. The table in the Las Vegas restaurant, on that specific night, was not just a place to dine, but a microcosm of the duo's internal tension and the price of American idolatry. Dean was dressed in an impeccable, expensive suit, which contrasted with the accidental wine stain on the waiter's tie, a concrete detail that served as the spark for his controlled explosion, and this disparity in status amplified the impact of the humiliation. Lewis watched the waiter struggle to maintain composure, his eyes registering every nuance of fear and shame in the man's posture, an image that took him back to his own days of struggle, the days of poverty and humiliation that he and Dean had shared in the small venues, and this visceral connection to Martin's victim intensified Lewis's dilemma: loyalty to the person or loyalty to the moral principle, a choice that fame had made unbearably difficult to make without consequences. The inciting incident began trivially. Like almost all great breakups, the waiter, a young man in his early 20s, exhausted after a double shift, approached the table with a bottle of red wine, an expensive and heavy Grand Cru from Bordeaux, whose details Dean Martin had insisted on checking. Perhaps the bright shine of the diamond in Martin's ring, perhaps the palpable tension hanging over the celebrity table, or perhaps simple tiredness, caused the young man's wrist to fail for an infinitesimal instant. The result was a dark splash of wine that not only stained the tip of Dean's jacket, but also hit the collar of his silk shirt, an error that, for most people, would be quickly resolved with an apology and the removal of the garment for cleaning, but which, in Dean Martin's mind at that moment, became a personal outrage and an opportunity to exert his newly acquired power. Dean Martin, who until then had been talking about the next season in Miami, suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream, forcing all heads in the room to turn to his table, captured by the unplanned spectacle. His movement was slow and deliberate, the hand holding the glass of whiskey lowered carefully, and he directed his gaze at the waiter, not with explosive anger, but with a calculating coldness and a sardonic smile, which was infinitely more destructive than manifest fury. The waiter froze, the bottle hanging in his hand, his face pale and covered in sweat, knowing, deep in his stomach, that his night, and possibly his job, had ended because of a moment's carelessness that would now become a circus of humiliation. The turning point was the moment Dean's sarcasm crossed the line of acceptability, turning a correction into public psychological torture, a clear manifestation of the ego corrupted by fame. He didn't just ask for a new coat. He began to question the waiter's intelligence, motor coordination, and right to even be in that luxurious environment. "You here to serve champagne or to plant grapes?" Dean asked, his voice low and calm, but heavy with contempt, ensuring that the waiter and everyone present knew how insignificant he considered him, an attitude that shocked Lewis. The symbolic object of the whiskey glass, once a mere prop, became a microphone of lack of control, and Lewis saw there, in that moment, not the friend who sang harmoniously with him, but an empty shell, coated with the cruelty that money and adulation had allowed to flourish. This event broke Jerry Lewis's fragile internal balance, which until that moment had managed to rationalize and ignore Martin's explosions of arrogance as tiredness or business pressure. The incident wasn't just about wine. It was about the loss of dignity of a simple man in front of an audience of the rich and famous. Lewis watched the waiter's paralysis of fear, his inability to defend himself, and this mirror of vulnerability deeply touched Lewis's memory of past difficulties, the days of poverty and humiliation that he and Dean had shared in the small theaters. Loyalty to the stage partner violently collided with his ethical conscience, and the starting point for the intervention was set. Lewis realized that, to save the waiter's dignity and, more importantly, his friend's soul, he would need to break the code of silence and confront the superstar ego, something that no one, not even he, dared to do in public. Lewis moved minimally in his chair, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried the weight of a monumental decision. His eyes, normally so expressive and alive, were now fixed on Dean Martin's glass, watching the whiskey swirl, a liquid vortex that seemed to mirror the confusion in his mind, the internal struggle between loyalty to his friend and the pressing need for justice. The humiliation continued, with Martin ironically detailing how the waiter should, from now on, use a trowel to serve liquids, and every sharp word was a nail in the duo's relationship. Louis tried to take a deep breath, feeling the heavy air of the restaurant in his lungs, and in that instant, the strong smell of Cuban cigar, previously associated with celebration and success, now seemed to him the suffocating odor of cynicism and power wielded irresponsibly, a sensory metaphor for the corruption he was witnessing. The camera, in Louis's view, focused on the waiter's bow tie knot, slightly crooked, a concrete detail that humanized the victim, making the abuse even more unbearable. Louis remembered a night in Ohio, years before, when he and Dean, hungry and penniless, shared a canned meat sandwich on the stairs of a theater, and the memory of that humble past amplified the hypocrisy of the present, intensifying his doubt. Had success stolen Dean's common sense forever? He wondered if this arrogance was permanent or just a facade created by exhaustion. He tried to find a trace of the old Dean, the man who laughed at himself, but only found the shielded superstar. In a subtle transition, Dean picked up the linen napkin, crumpled it dramatically, and threw it towards the waiter, demanding he replace it with another that was worthy of touching a star's table, a micro cliffhanger of cruelty that forced the waiter into an even deeper bow. Louis closed his eyes for a second, and this momentary introspection was the turning point. He could no longer be a passive spectator. The silent complicity was as condemnable as Martin's act. The conflict between loyalty and dignity reached its peak. Speaking could ruin the partnership. Silence would ruin his own character. He weighed the cost of both choices, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth, the cold adrenaline of the imminent moral confrontation. Louis opened his eyes and met the waiter's vacant gaze, a look that did not ask for help, but only expressed resignation, which ironically propelled him to act. He noticed that the waiter wore a simple watch, with a worn leather strap, an object that symbolized the honest and arduous journey of work, in stark contrast to the heavy gold watch Dean sported, and this material disparity reinforced the injustice. The micro scene changed focus. Dean took another sip, the whiskey flowing smoothly, and the liquid became a symbol of his lack of control. He was drowning in his own arrogance. Louis saw the exact moment when Dean's fingertip pointed to the waiter, in a final and humiliating gesture of command. The tension increased when Louis leaned forward, ready to speak, but hesitated, remembering private conversations where Dean vented about the pressure of being the serious part of the duo, the anchor of Louis's chaos, and how he felt he needed to maintain this tough guy image to gain respect. The doubt returned, the fear of being misunderstood, of worsening the situation. He wondered if his intervention would be perceived as an attack, and not as an act of care for his friend. Dean Martin's complexity, his facade of cynicism that hid a deep insecurity, was the fragility that Louis knew well and that now made his decision agonizing. The focus of the humiliation briefly shifted to the waiter's family, when Dean asked, with disdain, if his wife had taught him how to handle glasses, a low blow that crossed the line from professional criticism to personal attack. This change of target was the necessary shock for Louis. The attack on a man's dignity was unacceptable. He observed a ring that Dean wore, a gift from Louis for a great success, and this object of partnership and affection now seemed like a shackle, a symbol of the loyalty that prevented him from acting. Louis knew that, to save himself from becoming an accomplice, he needed to risk what the ring represented, the friendship. He searched for the right words, not words of anger, but of moral power. Dean, oblivious to his partner's internal storm, laughed coldly at his own joke, and the hollow, soulless sound of that laugh echoed in the forced silence of the room. The customers at the neighboring tables watched, some with pity, others with a morbid voyeurism, absorbing the drama. Louis felt the need to intervene physically, to touch Dean's arm, to silence him with a gesture, but resisted, knowing that the intervention needed to be verbal, precise, and definitive. His motivation was now crystal clear. Loyalty to character was superior to loyalty to the stage partnership. The waiter, with his eyes on the floor, symbolized the dignity that was being trampled. Louis realized he needed to use the duo's own history to reach Dean. He remembered the nights when they shared the stage with fear, not knowing if their career would last, and this shared vulnerability was the only language Dean could still understand. Ambition and pressure had created a wall of arrogance around Martin. Lewis looked at Dean's wine-stained jacket, and the vivid red color seemed like the blood of an open wound, the wound that fame had caused his friend's soul. He needed a phrase that would cut the ego without destroying the connection. That would be a reminder and not a condemnation. I want to know your opinion about this moment. Comment on what you would do in this situation. Remain silent to protect a valuable friendship or risk everything to defend a moral principle. Lewis's mind worked quickly, alternating between justified anger and genuine pain at seeing his friend fall. He imagined the waiter going home, telling his family about the degrading treatment, and this projection of the other's pain cemented his resolution. He ignored the fear of financial consequences or the breakdown of the duo, focusing only on the moral urgency. The air seemed thin. The wait for a reaction from Lewis was the new focus of tension in the room, and Dean, in his selfish blindness, seemed not even to notice the weight of his partner's gaze on him. Lewis moved his hand slowly toward the center of the table, resting it there, a gesture of firmness that contradicted his usually chaotic nature. He was preparing to speak up not as the clown, but as the man, the friend, and the moral judge of the situation. He felt the internal tremor, the legitimate fear of challenging Dean Martin's power in public, at the peak of his career, but the ethical impulse was irresistible. He knew that those few words, the 5 he had found, needed to be delivered with a moral stillness, a weight that would transform humiliation into reflection, and his voice would be the only object he would use. The humiliation reached its peak when Dean demanded that the waiter recite his name aloud, so that everyone would know who the incompetent of the night was, an act of extreme cruelty that sought to erase any trace of dignity. Lewis saw the waiter's sudden paleness, his body tensed by shame. The image of that man, a symbol of humility, being destroyed by the man who was the symbol of success, became the final trigger. Lewis's patience ran out. He realized that Martin's arrogance was not a lapse, but a dangerous path that needed to be intercepted, and the way to do it was with dignity and an intervention based on shared memory. Lewis fixed his eyes on Dean. He observed Martin's cigarette burn slowly in the crystal ashtray, the smoke rising in a spiral, a symbol of the slow combustion of that partnership. The pressure of the moment was so great that he could almost hear his own heart beating. He thought of the invisible audience, the audience of conscience, watching him, and knew he could not betray himself. The micro scene ended with Dean Martin leaning in, awaiting the waiter's fearful response, completely exposed to Lewis's imminent intervention, who was now preparing to deliver the most important line of dialogue of his entire life, a line that would define the friendship. The waiter, his voice choked, tried to stammer out his name, a forced confession of guilt, and that weak sound was enough. Lewis made a final move, a subtle adjustment in his chair, and his hand touched the table with firmness, a sign that the acting was over. He was no longer acting as the clown. It was Jerry Lewis, the man of principles, confronting his friend. The object of his attention was no longer the waiter, but Dean himself, whose expression of sadistic pleasure needed to be immediately erased. The mood in the room shifted from voyeurism to nervous anticipation, everyone sensing that the line had been crossed and that a response was coming. Lewis remembered a time they were kicked out of a bar for not having enough money to pay the bill, and the memory of shared shame was the poison and the remedy. He understood that Martin's arrogance came from the fear of returning to that point zero, and he needed to remind him of that fear. He opened his mouth, but not to shout or reprimand. His voice would be low, controlled, directed only at Dean, a moral whisper that would have the weight of thunder. He would use empathy as a weapon, memory as a hammer, and dignity as his only shield. The stage was set for the silent climax, and Lewis's word would be the only sound that mattered. Lewis took a deep breath, and the expensive aroma of the restaurant was replaced, in his mind, by the smell of theater grease and cheap show sweat. He saw Dean, not as the unreachable superstar, but as the young Dino Crocetti, with the same fear in his eyes that he now saw in the waiter. The duality of the situation was unbearable, and he needed to resolve it with surgical precision. He noticed the waiter's face, who expected the continuation of the punishment, but received, instead, Lewis's silence. The scene prepared to freeze in a single gesture of moral intervention, a pause in time where ethics would confront fame. Lewis finally made his decisive move, a gesture that paralyzed the room, not by the stridency, but by the absolute calm with which he broke the tense silence. He leaned closer to Dean, and his voice, which could fill an auditorium with roaring laughter, was now a low murmur, directed only at his partner, but with enough intensity that the waiter and the closest tables felt the urgency and injustice of the situation. He did not attack Dean's character, but questioned Dean's memory, aiming at the core of his friend's vulnerability. The emotional weight of the narrative focused on the tension between the surrounding luxury, the silver cutlery, the fine china, and the moral misery of Dean's attitude, creating a shocking dissonance for the spectator and Dean himself. Dean Martin, accustomed to silencing others with a look or sharp sarcasm, was caught completely off guard by Lewis's quiet intervention. His expression, previously satisfied with his own cruelty, wavered, showing a crack of shock and perhaps even shame. Lewis used a progressive increase in pressure by not diverting his gaze, forcing Dean to confront not the waiter, but himself in the mirror of his friend's loyalty. The urgency was in the speed with which the waiter's dignity was draining away, and the need to interrupt the vicious cycle of power abuse that fame had instituted in Dean, a mission that Lewis felt was his, as a partner and guardian of the duo's original humility. Lewis took a step forward in the emotional escalation by evoking the memory of the duo's struggle in the past, a sacred ground for both. He used empathy as a tool to expose Dean's hypocrisy. "Dino, look at him," said Lewis, using Dean's childhood nickname, a move that instantly stripped him of the armor of Dean Martin, the superstar, bringing back the humble Dino Crocetti. The emotional weight of the narrative focused on the tension between the surrounding luxury and the moral misery of Dean's attitude, creating a shocking dissonance for the spectator and Dean himself. The waiter, who expected Dean's explosion of anger directed at Lewis for daring to intervene, witnessed, instead, the crooner's momentary silence, an unexpected turn. This dramatic pause built the expectation for the culminating moment. Lewis took advantage of Dean's hesitation, realizing that he had hit the insecurity underlying the arrogance, and reinforced the sense of moral injustice by keeping the waiter's dignity intact with his quietness. The growing feeling of pressure came from the fact that this conversation was not happening in a private dressing room, but on the public stage of their life. Lewis knew that the moment was all or nothing. He was risking the biggest entertainment partnership in the world for a waiter he would never see again, a gesture that was the biggest test of his own character. He did not shout. He just reaffirmed, with the weight of years of friendship. He reminded him of the smell of cheap grease and the desperate hope that united them before the glory, linking these concrete events of the past to the unsustainable arrogance of the present. The construction of the expectation for the 5 final words was almost unbearable, as everyone at the table knew that Lewis was about to deliver the line that would either seal reconciliation or cement the rupture. Dean's silence, at the height of the tension, was a confession. Lewis leaned in a little more, ensuring that the waiter could hear what was being said. His voice was a bridge between the humble man Dean was and the ego monster he was becoming. Lewis used his own fragility and loyalty to pressure his friend, and the words that followed, the 5 words that summarized his intervention, were the culmination of all the dramatic escalation. He did not need screams. He only needed the bare and raw truth, supported by love and the memory of their humble origin. Lewis, his voice low and loaded with a solemnity that he rarely used outside the dramatic stage, fixed his gaze deep into Dean's eyes, who avoided contact for an instant before being forced to face him by the intensity of the moment. It was then that Lewis uttered the phrase that paralyzed Dean Martin and resonated throughout the room with a power that the greatest of speeches would not have achieved. He said simply, subtly pointing to the trembling waiter with the tip of his chin, "We've been there, Dino." The 5 words were delivered not as an attack, but as a deep and almost painful reminder of the shared reality of their initial poverty, of the humiliation they both felt when treated as nobodies in the early stages of their careers. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Dean Martin's reaction was the central turning point and the most important symbolic gesture of the entire narrative. He did not explode in anger, did not counterattack with sarcasm, nor did he try to divert attention. Instead, the superstar, the man of ice on stage, subtly paled, and the cold smile that was on his lips fell apart into an expression of recognition and profound shame. Lewis had hit the nerve. Dean's fear was not just of no longer being the humble man from Ohio, but the fear that his arrogance would isolate him and make him identical to the authority figures they so despised at the beginning of their lives. The silence that followed Lewis's phrase was total, heavy, and made everyone in the room hold their breath, witnessing an intimate moral confrontation. Dean picked up the whiskey glass, the symbolic object of his lack of control and facade, and instead of drinking to hide, he placed it on the table with extreme slowness and precision, a gesture of dominance over his own impulsivity, a silent acknowledgement of his mistake and the truth in Lewis's words. He looked briefly at the waiter, not with anger, but with a sudden and painful empathy. The waiter, in turn, was astonished, seeing Martin's figure, previously grand, diminish under the weight of his own partner's moral rebuke. The climax was not an explosion, but a controlled implosion of Dean's ego, induced by Lewis's dignity and ethical love, an unforgettable moment of forced humility. The climax ended with Dean Martin shaking his head once, a subtle acknowledgement to Lewis that said, "I understood." He did not apologize to the waiter out loud, maintaining a remnant of his facade, but the damage had been repaired by Lewis's morally superior gesture. Lewis, in turn, returned the look with a resolute calm, without triumph, only relief. The man in the expensive suit and the man in the stained apron were witnesses to the moment when fame and money were set aside, and character, flawed and corrected, reassumed its central place at the table. The final symbolic gesture was Lewis taking his own clean napkin and placing it gently beside Dean's glass, a mute sign that the stage was clean and that they could, perhaps, move forward. The immediate consequences of the climax altered the environment of the table and the restaurant palpably. The tension dissolved, not into celebration, but into a reflective silence. Dean Martin, still in silence, made a subtle gesture, almost a nod to the waiter, who understood. The superstar did not need words. He took his wallet and placed a folded amount of money on the edge of the table, much more than the cost of the coat and the waiter's salary for a month, an act of financial reparation that, although late, served as the only way for Dean to demonstrate his embarrassment without completely breaking his persona. The money, previously a symbol of destructive power, became a vehicle for apology, and the waiter, with teary eyes, took the note and quietly withdrew, his dignity restored not by the wealth, but by the ethical intervention he had witnessed. Lewis said nothing more, not even an "I told you so" look. He just started talking casually about the next show, returning to the professional tone of the partnership, allowing Dean to save face publicly. The friendship, however, had been changed forever, marked by the brutal and necessary honesty of the moment. Dean, who always valued loyalty, knew that Lewis had risked the partnership to save him from his own arrogance, an act of love and character that was more valuable than any applause in Las Vegas. The social environment returned to normal, but now under the shadow of that moral intervention, a reminder that even at the pinnacle of fame, money and ego could not buy respect or silence the conscience. The final scene of the resolution, before they left the restaurant, was a look exchange between the partners, a moment of profound mutual understanding. Dean Martin looked at Lewis, and there was gratitude and a visible discomfort in his eyes. The struggle between the wounded ego and the grateful man Lewis returned the look with an expression that said, "Remember where we came from." Lewis's act became a catalyst for internal reflection in Dean, a reminder of the duo's humble origins and a test of friendship that Martin had failed, but that Lewis had passed with flying colors, showing that the true measure of a man was not his ability to entertain, but his ability to maintain humanity, even under the dazzling lights of Las Vegas. The incident was never discussed publicly by either of them, becoming just another of the silent secrets that sustained and, eventually, corroded the Martin and Lewis partnership. But that moment in the restaurant, Jerry Lewis's quiet intervention and Dean Martin's stunned silence, remained as a moral scar, a point of no return in Dean's ethical trajectory. The story is not about the wine stain, but about the stain on the character, and how the humility of one partner could, for an instant, rescue the dignity of the other. The true lesson, etched in fire in that luxurious room, is that success is only worthwhile when it does not demand the loss of humanity, and that the greatest strength of an artist lies in his ability to remember the waiter, because he is the mirror of the past that must never be forgotten. This story serves as a timeless tale about the abuse of power and moral courage, showing that the most powerful voice is not always the loudest. Dean Martin's silence that night spoke louder than any note he sang, and it was a testimony that true friendship requires correction, not complacency. The question that remains, echoing in the vacuum that success often leaves, is not whether the duo should have broken up, but whether Dean Martin's character would have survived fame without that reality check. And in your opinion, was Lewis's gesture an act of betrayal of friendship, or a fundamental demonstration of moral loyalty? Do you believe that, at the height of fame, what would be your moral yardstick? Would you have found the right 5 words to intervene? Leave your comment,